secret place where I see your face. Will you take me there again? You can search my heart in the deepest part, from beginning to the end. You can have my soul, just like Jericho. Come and tear down my walls. And I am in your hands. You are the promised land. You are the king of my heart. To you my eyes are lifted. To you my prayer is rising up. You've captured my attention. Consume me, God. Give me a heart abandoned, ever after you alone. Gold and silver, you can take it. All I want is you alone. God, give me a heart abandoned, ever after you alone. Gold and silver, you can take it. All I want is you alone.
Well, hey everyone, my name is Matt Kuman and I'm the groups pastor here at the Foundry, and I'm so excited to end this week in our series on Distinct. We've spent the last 7 weeks diving in on this group of people, the Israelites, that God has made distinct, and today we get to wrap up that series. But we've been looking through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and we're going to end today in Joshua. But I want a quick recap where we've been through this series, because we've focused on a lot of books through here and we've been moving really quickly, but there's been so much really significance on this group of people and the journey that they've been on. We followed them through Egypt, right? In the very beginning of Exodus, the Israelites were in Egypt. They were in slavery, and God heard them call out to him in Egypt. And God saved his people. He delivered them from slavery. We saw how God provided for them in the desert. They went out of Egypt and they were in the desert for years. And God provided for them in the desert by giving them water from the rock and for giving them manna from the sky. God provided for his people even in the midst of being in the desert. We see how God was present with his people. He wanted that close relationship with him. And we see how that is placed out in the tabernacle. And God says, I want to be with you. I want to be present in your community. And this is what it's going to take for that to happen, which moves us into Leviticus, which was this big book of law about what it meant for God to live in close proximity with his people. We learned about atonement and what that meant for that group of people, to knowing that we sin and knowing that those people sinned, what it meant to still live in that right relationship with God. After Leviticus, we get to the book of Numbers, and we found that in Numbers, the people didn't always trust God, that they were defiant against who God was sometimes, even though he always provided for them and he was always there for them, we find that the Israelites were still defiant against him. But we learned at the end of Numbers that God points out what it means to have a heavenly perspective. That sometimes that people and even us as people don't see God's perspective in things. They would sometimes turn away from him because they didn't see his view of how they were going to be moving forward. That our view is not always the best view and that we may not understand what God is doing because he has a different perspective than us. There is a heavenly perspective there. And last week, we looked through the book of Deuteronomy and the importance of remembering what God has done for us. And remembering, for the Israelites, it was remembering how God took them out of Egypt, right? It provided for them, delivered them. And what we realize is that when we forget what God has done in our lives, often we stray away from who God is. And so we need to remember how God has been faithful in our lives. And that brings us to the next part of the Bible where we start looking at the book of Joshua. And what I love about where we've been so far throughout this distinct series through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and now Joshua is that even though the people of Israel who have been made distinct, even though they continue to fall, and even though they continue to sin, God remains faithful. And God remains wanting that right relationship with his people. So that leaves us with the book of Joshua to end with today. And at the end of the book, we find that Joshua is pleading for the people to do one thing. And we'll get there in just a minute. But I want to set the book of Joshua up with some context. In the book of Joshua, we're introduced to a character named Joshua. And you're like, wow, Matt, you really did your study this week, right? Yeah, Joshua. But Joshua, we're not actually introduced to him here. He's actually been throughout our stories of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. He's been in our story throughout this whole time. Joshua was actually in his youth when the Israelites were in Egypt. And so he saw when God sent the plagues on Egypt. He saw when God parted the Red Sea. He was there for that moment to see where God was being faithful in the lives of the Israelites and delivering them out of that slavery. We find in Exodus 24, I'm going to kind of walk through a few sections that we see some of Joshua's character come out because we can understand more fully who Joshua is. In Exodus 24, we find that Joshua alone is allowed to accompany Moses up the holy mountain where the tablets of the law are received. Often we just think Moses went up there, but Joshua was his aide in that. Joshua went up with Moses on the mountain. In Exodus 33, we find that Joshua never left the tent of meeting, right? This is that moment, if you remember, where Moses goes and meets with God, and Joshua is standing outside the tent, and he never leaves that. His character shows us that he's a man of his word, and he's going to stay there. He wants to be in close proximity with Moses, who has that direct relationship with God. He wants to be faithful to what God is calling them to. And then we jump into Numbers, where in Numbers 14, Joshua is the one that is elected to represent his tribe to go into the promised land and to scout and to spy and to see once what the promised land would offer and what it might take to get the promised land. Like, what are we looking at here? And what's so fascinating is coming out of that, after they've kind of looked over the land, they come back. And all of the spies except two say, this land is great. Like the fruits and the vegetables that are in this land are bigger than we've ever seen, but the people are also huge. Like they are more numerous, they are larger than us. I don't think we'll ever be able to overcome them. But Joshua and Caleb are the two people who say, no, but with God by our side, we can take this. Like this is nothing with God by our side. And they're the only two that trusted that God would continue to provide for them. And we also find In Deuteronomy, towards the end of Deuteronomy, when Moses is really on his deathbed, we find God choose Joshua as being the person who is going to take Moses' work of delivering the people out of Egypt, of walking them through the desert. Joshua is going to be the man who brings that work to completion and brings them to the promised land to establish Israel in the land that God had promised them for years and years. And at this point, we're now at the end of Deuteronomy. It feels like Israel is just on the cusp of something, right? They've been in Egypt, they've been in slavery, and so far they've been just wandering in the desert for years and years and years, and they are in sight of the promised land. Like there's something that's just about to happen here. They're on the cusp of something new, and this is where they get the view of the promised land. And God has promised them. And God says this in Joshua 1 verse 2. It says this, Moses, my servant is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites. So this is the moment they're looking. They can see the promised land that God has offered them. It's just over this Jordan River. Verse 3, I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. And I want to pull up a picture of this. You can kind of see the Jordan River is on the east side of the promised land. And they're going to need to cross this Jordan River to have this promise. And it's actually a lot of real estate in this promised land that they're going to need to get into and conquer, because there's nations that are currently occupying it. It's not empty territory. There's people that are in this land. Verse 5, no one will be able to stand against you all of the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Verse 6, be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give to them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything that is written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Do you notice any just repetition in those verses? We see 3 times through that short little passage of scripture, the words be strong and courageous come up. See, God has made a distinct group of people in the Israelites, right? He has called them out of Egypt and they've wandered in the desert. And now he's saying be strong and courageous, because God knows what they're about to encounter, right? From the spies that went out, they know what is on the other side of the Jordan. They know that it is going to be bigger men than them, that maybe more numerous than them. They don't think they can do it, but God is saying, be strong and courageous. I know what is coming, but I will be with you in these things. They would need to be all in with God, because he would be able to provide for them if they were strong and courageous in who he is. God reminds them, do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And Joshua is given this promise of don't be afraid. Don't worry about it. If you're all in with me, I will take care of you. Do not be afraid. There was a moment a few years ago that we went out for dinner with Jolene's extended family and her grandpa. I love her grandpa. He was such a great man. And towards the end of his life, he couldn't see for anything, really. I'm going to be honest with you. There were times where he'd be driving and we're like, what can you see anymore? He's like, well, I kind of can see the yellow lines. And I'm like, that's how you drive? You just follow the yellow lines? Like, if he was ever driving, I made sure I was far away from Zealand because I didn't want to be anywhere near it. But he couldn't see real well towards the end of his life. So a lot of us as family would try and make sure we were driving him places to keep the community safe. And there was a time that we went with everybody out to dinner out in Holland. And on the way there, we were just telling stories, and he was always a storyteller, and we were just laughing about some things. And then on the way home, it had started raining. Like, we're talking buckets of rain. It was pouring out. Windshield wipers are going nuts. And I'm driving along. And I'm super comfortable driving in like a lot of snow and a lot of rain. I actually enjoy a little fear in the drive. And I look over, and he's in the passenger seat, and he's like hanging on to like the grip pad and like the armrest. And I'm like, what's wrong? He's like, can you slow down maybe just a bit? I can't see anything. And I'm like, well, I can, but I can see. And the whole ride home, he's just like, his legs are twitching. And at this point, I may have taken advantage of it. And Jalen was probably kicking my seat in the back because I'm like, oh, I'm going to go quicker now because I thought it was enjoyable. But he's like hanging on. He's like, can you please slow down? I can't see anything. Like, I don't know what's coming. I can't see with the windshield wipers going so quick. It's raining so much. I don't know what's coming. And I kept explaining to him, but I can see. I can see clearly. I can see the road. I'm familiar with the roads that we're on. I know what's coming. I know what to expect. You don't have to worry. You don't have to be afraid. And it made me think as I was preparing for this, like, how often is that the case for us? Like, on the way to the restaurant, there were no concerns. I think he fully trusted me in my driving abilities. But on the way home, he questioned everything. And how often is that in our lives where we're able to say in our safe places, where we're surrounded by Christians, that, yeah, I am all in for God. I'm all in for being a Christian. And then when life throws a little storm at us, when things get harder than we expect, when we can't see what is coming in the future and there's uncertainty, all of a sudden, don't we back off of being all in a bit because we don't have the control, right? I think Jalen's grandpa's issue was he didn't have control of the situation. And I think so often when we don't have control, we are way more less likely to be all in, right? We want to gain that control back. So we start grabbing at the things that we can control. And what God is saying in this to Joshua and to the people of Israel, he's saying, you're going to encounter some things that you've never seen before. You're going to encounter things that are scary and uncertain, and you may not know what to do. But if you're all in, if you trust me, if you obey me, I will be with you and I will take care of you. Be strong and courageous because we can do this as we go into the land that I've promised you. Keep your eyes on me as we go into this. So this is the setting. This is where we've seen Joshua have this with God, and he's telling the people this. Now look with me to this story of Jericho. It starts out in chapter 5, verse 1. It says this, their hearts melted in fear. Now, what is this even talking about? Their hearts melted in fear. This is speaking to the Amorite and Canaanite kings that were melting in fear. Now, they were melting in fear because at this point, the Israelites have crossed the Jordan River. Now, the Jordan River wasn't a huge river, but it was about 100 foot long, or 100 foot wide. And long would not have been like, wow, couldn't you just walk around it? Yeah, whatever. Anyway, so it's 100 foot wide, but at this time of year, it would have been flood season. So this Jordan River would have been raging. It would have been moving really quickly. Now, God, when the Israelites crossed the river, the water was kind of pinned up further up the river, so the Israelites were able to cross over on dry ground. Now, that river doesn't just stop. It got built up in an area. That doesn't happen quietly. Like, the Aryan nations would have heard about what happened when the Jordan River was like stopped. Right? They would have the word would have started going around like, what happened? Why did that happen? Who crossed that river? And whose God do they serve that their God was able to stop the Jordan River during floods? Like, what is happening? The story about the Israelites' God was starting to go around. And this is what we find in chapter 5, when their hearts melted in fear, because these kings knew that the Israelites were coming to take the promised land that God had promised them, and they were in that land, right? So the God that stopped the Jordan River was also going to be taking their land away from them. So everyone would have heard about it. So these nations who are in the promised land would have probably known that, okay, it's starting to go around that they're coming to conquer all of our land. So here's a question. What do you do if you're one of the nations that is potentially about to be conquered? You hunker down, right? How many of you have been at home minding your own business, maybe cleaning, maybe watching TV, and the doorbell goes off unexpectedly? What do? You hunker down. You hide under the couch. You turn off all the lights. The TV goes off. You tell your kids, quiet, we don't know who's out there, right? You just hunker down. You don't know what to expect. And this is what we find in Joshua. They hunker down. It says the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went in and no one came out. The doorbell went off and they're like, they hid. Nothing is happening. Okay, it brings us to verse 2. Then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands along with its king and its fighting men. See, it hasn't even happened yet. And God says, I've already done it. Like, I've delivered Jericho into your hands. They're right there. Verse 3, it says, march around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them, sound a long blast on the trumpets. Have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it. And he ordered the army, advance, march around the city with the armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord. When Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time, the trumpets were sounding, but Joshua had commanded the army, do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices, do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then shout. So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the army returned to the camp and spent the night there. Sounds like a dramatic scene, doesn't it? But when you look at it, it really isn't. Like, the whole army is walking behind the ark of the Lord, but the army's silent. Joshua tells them, do not shout, do not say a word. There's trumpets, right? Those are sounding, but outside of that, the army's quiet. There's not a word coming from the army. You can imagine the people in the city, like, looking out of this happening, and they're like, what's going on out there? It's like, I think they brought their marching band. Like, there's trumpets blasting, but they're just going around once, and now they're going home. Like, what is this? There's confusion. I'm sure it looked like a crazy scene. Like, they're not even going to attack us. Like, they've got all the people, but they're just blowing their trumpets. Like, what is this? This looked, I'm sure, crazy to them. It continues, verse 12. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. Then the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord, blowing the trumpets. The army men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the 2nd day, they marched around the city once more and returned to camp. So they do the exact same thing over again the 2nd day. And it continues that they did this for 6 days. For 6 days, like, this continues to happen. Not 1, not 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 days of them marching once around the city with the army that is silent and the sound of trumpets. And where we find verse 15. On the seventh day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. All right? Before they were just doing it once. On day 7, they circled it 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you this city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord." Only Rahab, which we'll talk about her in just a few minutes, only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in the house shall be spared, because she had hid the spies we sent. Now remember, when the spies went into the city, they were looking to see what it was going to look like. They sent 2 spies into that, so that's what they're talking about there. But keep away from the devoted things, that you are not to bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. God's telling them, don't plunder the stuff. Otherwise, you will make camp of Israel liable to destruction and being trouble on it. All the silver and gold and all the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go to his treasury. Then in verse 20, it says, when the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpets, the men gave a loud shout. The walls collapsed, and everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. See, talk about obedience, right? When we look at this story, we see what God did out of their obedience. Even though it seemed crazy, even the process that it took for the walls to come down, like they didn't attack until God said to shout. God gave them specific instructions about what it meant to obey. And because of their obedience to God, God delivered the city of Jericho into their hands. God is saying, trust me in this. I'll take care of you. See, what happened when the Israelites obeyed? Even though it did seem crazy, the walls came down. God delivered the people into their hands. And what I think is so fascinating throughout the Bible, specifically what we've read so far in the Old Testament, is that obedience to God sometimes does look crazy. Even looking at the story of Noah, when he built an ark that was massive on dry ground, right? Like, what does this look like? The world was looking at him saying he was crazy. Even obedience to crossing the Jordan River for the Israelites, right? The Jordan River was in flood season, and the priests started walking in before it became dry ground. So they had to take a step of obedience into the waters, not knowing that the waters were going to stop, not knowing that the raging rivers wouldn't take them, but they had to trust in God's provision that he would continue to provide for them. Obedience to God sometimes looks crazy to the world. And in this moment where they're surrounding Jericho, where they've been marching around it for 7 days, where they're shouting at the city, like that would have looked ridiculous. And yet being obedient to God is what mattered in this moment. See, what we see throughout the rest of the book of Joshua, the people of Israel continued to be obedient to God, and he continued to deliver people into their hands, and they continued to expand into the promised land. And what we find in the rest of the book is that about the first half is God delivering the promised land to them. And the other half is them dividing up the promised land between the 12 tribes of Israel. And then at the end of the book, we find in Joshua 24 that plea from Joshua. And Joshua 24 realizes that he's nearing the end of his life. And I think his plea is so important to take note of, because he's been with Israel for so long, right? He was a youth back in Egypt. So he has seen how God has continued to provide for them and what it meant when Israel was obedient to him. He's seen God's faithfulness out of their obedience. So he's saying to Israel, in chapter 24, he has this plea posture in him. He's saying, fear the Lord and serve him with faithfulness. Throw away all of those foreign gods that you have and only worship the one God. Only worship the God of Israel. Turn to God. See, Joshua is saying to the people of Israel, be all in. Be all in. You've seen how God's been faithful to us. Don't continue to have one foot in with God and one foot in the foreign gods. Turn away from the idols. Remember, Joshua has seen the golden calf and how when things seem to get hard, they turn towards other gods. He's pleading with them in this, saying, don't continue to do that. See how God has been faithful in our lives. See what it meant when we were obedient to him, how he's provided. When we have been all in, God has been faithful in our lives. And this is the final plea that we see from Joshua in chapter 24. So what does that look like? Right? How do we be obedient? How do we be all in for what God has set forth in our lives? And I think that answer actually comes in the very beginning of Joshua, when God is speaking to Joshua. It says this, I want to remind you in Joshua 1, verse 7. It says, be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. What does it mean to be obedient? It means to be in the Word of God. It means to be obedient to what God is speaking. Have the book of the law, have God's Word in your heart so that you know what it looks like to be obedient. And being all in to obedience means that there's going to be some times that the world looks at you as crazy, that sometimes it may feel super scary, but being all in means being obedient even when we can't see what's way out ahead of us. For those of you who were in devotions this week, you read about two characters that we really didn't get a chance to get into at all today. Rahab, which we mentioned earlier, she was the prostitute that allowed the spies to come in, and she hid the spies and allowed them to get back. And she was the one that made the deal with them, like, I believe that your God is a powerful God, and will you save me? Because I want to serve this God, right? That's Rahab. She was that prostitute living in Jericho. And in devotions, you also read about a man named Achan, who was a soldier for the army of Israel. And Achan, in one of the battles, he took some of the gold, right? When God said, do not take anything, do not plunder it for yourselves, Achan did not listen to that. He did not obey God. He really didn't trust that God would provide for them. So he hid a bunch of that stuff underneath his tent. And because of that, their next battle, they ended up losing because they didn't remain faithful to what God had said. We see two characters who live very different lives. One person who was an Israelite in the camp of Israel, and one who was a prostitute from a foreign land. And what I want you to understand in this is that it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter your past. It doesn't matter what you've done in the past. If you believe in God, and if you trust in God and obey his commands, and you're all in for who God is and what he has for your life, it doesn't matter your past. God will provide for you in that. We see that God trusted God and he provided for her. Who was all in that moment, right? It was Rahab in that. I want us to understand that God loves you regardless of your past, and if you choose him, he will accept you in that. I want to look back to remembering the image in the bumper video. Right in the very beginning of the bumper video, there was a lot of images of water. And there was actually waterfalls from Zambia that you look at that and you see just the power behind it. And often when we look at that, you fear water. Right? But at the end of the video, there were kids who were jumping around in pure joy in puddles, right? It's the same thing, just a different context in what that water was in. And I want to end today with the posture of kids. with the understanding of the joy and excitement that they have jumping in that water, that they didn't have any fear. There can be fear in water, but the posture of these kids were pure joy, trusting that the water was okay. In the same way, when we are all in for who God is and the vision He has for our lives, God is going to provide. When we are obedient to Him, He will provide for us. We don't need to be scared. I want to leave you with these last words that were spoken to Joshua that I think speaks so clearly to what it looks like for us to live all in the world we live in yet today. He says, I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous. See, church, I think we need to hear these words. Even though we're thousands of years separated from when these words were first spoken, we need to hear that in this world today. Be strong and courageous. What is going to be crazy for this world, for us to do, to be courageous for what God is asking us to do, may look very different. But God is saying, be strong and courageous. I am not going to leave you. I am not going to forsake you. The question for you today is this: do you accept those words? Do you trust that He will be, that you can be strong, that you can be courageous if you're all in for God? Are you willing to be all in? Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for Joshua and the way we were able to just follow his story throughout Exodus all the way through Joshua to see how he continued to be faithful, and the plea that he had for the people of Israel to be strong and courageous regardless of what they faced. God, I ask that we take those words today to heart, that we understand that we live in a world that is hard to be courageous in. But I ask that we remember that you're with us, that you'll never leave us, that you'll never forsake us, and that your words hold so much truth, and you stand by those words. God, I ask that you give us courage. I ask that you give us strength when the world laughs at us, when the world thinks that we're crazy. God, give us the power to stand firm in those moments. God, we ask this all in your name we pray. Amen.